r/NoSleep. Posted by you/The Dangerous. I will never walk in the woods after dark. I live in a village out in the woods. As a child I heard a lot of stories about the monsters that live in the forest, and how I shouldn't wander too far. It's always been fairly obvious to me that they were more there to keep me from staying out too late than actual warnings. As I've grown older, I found that the forest was a great place to wind down, especially at night. There's something about the silence that's so calming to me. It's dark and the air is fresh, and I'm alone. It was pitch black outside when I was out on a usual path that I take through the forest. It was cold enough that I kept my hands in my pockets, but it wasn't so cold as to bother me. The walk was about 20 minutes and I was 3 minutes in. I couldn't hear anything. Usually I'd hear the buzzing of the lights shining on the dirt road or the wind blowing against my ear, but not tonight. I heard nothing but for my breath and my shoes against the dirt. A bad feeling grew in my gut and every few seconds I looked back, but I only saw the empty road still as ice. I looked to the side, into the dark forest. The lights shining on the dirt road were so strong that they created an effect, making the darkness of the forest that much more black, like a void that kept on going forever. A bad feeling grew in my gut. Every few seconds I looked back, but I only saw the empty road. I looked to the side into the dark forest. The darkness covered everything. It was like a void in which anything could stand. A hungry wolf, or perhaps a madman. It was completely ordinary. But I felt watched. It was an itch in the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I knew it was completely illogical, but my gut told me to stay on guard. It told me that something was up. Every few seconds I jerked my head back to see if anything had jumped out of the woods and started running towards me. I couldn't help gluing my eyes to the darkness of the woods, ready to see something, anything. I stumbled, my foot hitting up against a large brown root reaching over the road. It had been so sudden. I felt energy spike up through my body. That simple stumble had sent me into a state of panic. But it was brief, and I couldn't help but blame myself for being paranoid. I'd done this at least 1,000 times. Nothing had gone wrong then. Not even the first time I was surrounded by darkness did I feel this scared. What was so special about tonight that my gut felt this way? I kept thinking about that, and I kept looking around. I wasn't scared enough to start running even though a large part of me eagerly wanted to. That would just be too insane. The next 10 minutes of my walk, each single sound or movement, sent me into a panic, and when I saw an oddly large tree just beside the road, I stared at it like my life depended on it. It was an oak tree as thick as 5 humans. Its skin was filled with many different cracks. I spotted small cuts into it. Vertical slashes, as if somebody had held a knife practiced cutting. There were 5 of them. I couldn't help but imagine what was behind the tree. In my mind I saw a naked, ghost white figure that would shriek when I saw it and rush at me with rage. But I knew it was my fear speaking. I'd walk past, and see nothing. As I walked on the side of the street the furthest away from the tree, I was about to release the breath stuck in my lungs, but I was a hideous man standing there with a wide grin on his face and eyes that jerked into mine, and I saw his smile grow wider as he took one large step towards me, and my heart jolted for the 50th time. I only saw him for a fraction of a second, but that image is stuck in my mind. The man's face was too large for his features. His eyes, nose, mouth were mere pricks on the giant skin of his face. I remember that he'd cut off his right ear completely, and that there was only a small hole there. He was completely bald, and the wrinkles on his forehead reached up far, almost to the middle of his head. I remember seeing his eyes. They weren't cold, dead eyes, but ones filled with energy and life, as if this was the most exciting moment, something he'd waited for a very long time, and worked very hard to attain. As I was running, I remember glancing back to see his face filled with rage. He was large and fat, and I heard his steps thumping against the dirt path as he ran behind me with a knife raised high. He didn't expect things to turn out like this. I don't think I've ever in my entire life run so fast. The pain was gone. The exhaustion too. My legs moved on their own. Something instinctual took over. Something which had dwelled inside of me since the beginning and finally showed its face. I heard him behind me. For 5 minutes I heard him behind me. Sometimes I ran under lights that had broken, and the dirt road turned pitch black, and it was the scariest then. I heard his heavy breathing. He screamed. It wasn't anger but more frustration. There were no words in it. Just a bestial, animal roar. I glanced back to see that he'd stopped. He just stopped, turned around, and walked straight off the path and into the forest in the middle of the night. I didn't stop running until I was home. I slammed shut my door and locked it, trying the handle to make sure that it was stuck. I heard my heart deafeningly throbbing in my ears. When the fear left me, I fell down on the ground, gasping for air. I realized then where those stories had come from. The next story of this video. Posted by you/Avatar of Horror. I found my dead mother's journal. I can't say my life has been a happy one. My mother committed suicide under unexplained circumstances when I was little and was raised by my grandmother since my father was already out of the picture. I hated living with the old harridan as she would constantly curse my mother, her own daughter, and her memory, and each time was like a dagger through my heart. She would say my mother meddled with unholy powers and reaped the rewards. I always took that as additional spite heaped on a dead person, but now I know there might be some truth in those words. My grandmother's house was old, colonial times old, with rickety floorboards that creaked when you so much as breathed. A few months ago I was in my room, which was my mother's in times past, and I stepped onto a floorboard that broke. After I finished swearing and pulling my leg out from the newly made hole, I noticed something inside. It was a small leather-bound book just slightly larger than my hand. Retrieving the hidden item, I opened it up to see the inside cover read Journal of Catherine Palmer, my mother's name. I was simply elated, as here was a full journal of my mother's own writings. Not ever getting to know her has been one of the greatest pains in my life, and here was a chance to hear her own thoughts in her own words. This was a chance to connect in a way I never thought possible. The first few pages of entries were as normal as could be. This was written when she was clearly a teenager when she started to write it, so most of the topics included complaints about school and teachers, gossip about her friends, and other slice-of-life commentary. It made me so happy to read these pages, to get to know my mother a bit better. I was going to tell my grandmother I had found this treasure, but thought better of it, fearing she would snatch it away. Each day I'd read a few more entries, trying to immerse myself in her world as she experienced it. Some of the entries mentioned being scared about eyes watching her, but I took that as metaphor, or it was just a misunderstanding to me as a reader. But the journal began to become strange though as it went on. A clear time gap occurred, jumping to when she was a young adult. I cried with unbridled joy when she mentioned giving birth to me with this entry. January 17th. She came. My little angel came today. I sit here in the hospital bed looking at her as I write this, and my heart is full of happiness. I really thought that Donnie would come after all, but I guess he couldn't get past what I had told him. No matter though, I will love and protect my little angel from anything. She stopped writing about her day-to-day life and instead began to speak about experiencing strange occurrences. Let me share one of the entries so you understand. May 7th. I've been seeing the eyes again. Father Donovan and my mother assure me I'm just seeing things, but I know they are there. When it is dark at night, when there is deep shadow in the hallway, if I stare too long I can see the eyes staring back at me. I hope for my little angel she will never experience this. Mustering up the courage, I went to my grandmother with what I had found, careful to hide the journal before doing so. You found what? The crone groaned at me. I found a journal my mother wrote, and I wanted to ask you some questions. With a wide-eyed terror she grabbed me by the shoulders. What journal? Did you read it? Tell me. Of course I did, shaking free of her surprisingly strong grip. That's why I wanted to know about these eyes she kept referring to might be about. My world blinked for a moment as I was struck across the face. You will give me that journal and you will never, never, speak of this again, do you hear me? It was reflex, it was anger, but I shoved her backwards away from myself. As she fell, she hit the ground and let out a guttural scream as I heard bones shatter. After calling an ambulance and taking her to the hospital, I was told she had broken her hip and was in a mild coma from the fall. The feelings of anger and guilt melded when I got home to the old empty house, and I just cried on the floor that night. When I awoke it was sometime early in the AM. The house was silent save for my labored breathing from the events. As I opened my eyes, for the briefest of moments, in the corner of the room I saw a pair of glowing eyes looking back at me. I shot upwards standing, and as I blinked they were gone. The next few days were a blur as I was balancing life with visiting my grandmother in the hospital. Why had she reacted so strongly? Wouldn't she want to know more about her daughter? In the room where my grandmother lay, another coma patient was there. A woman, probably mid-30s, would come and visit, and we would make small talk. As I had been engrossed reading my mother's journal, she asked me once what I was so engaged in. I explained what it was and how I was trying to get a better understanding of my mother. I'm so sorry to hear about that, hon. Name's Giselle, she said in a sharp mid-Atlantic accent. You know, I'm a medium. I could do a session with you and you can speak with your mother. Ever the skeptic of someone beaten down in life, I politely refused. That night I came to the last written entry in the book. I had been dreading this moment as it meant the end of my new connection to my mom. The following entry left me breathless. December 16th. I saw the eyes looking at my little angel last night. I won't let them get her too. Mom says I've invited enough misery and maybe she is right. I'm going to end this once and for all. I love you, my angel. I didn't know what to do with that. How could I? Did ending it mean she had decided to commit suicide or something else? Who or what are these eyes that seem to haunt her? If I could only ask her, if I could just understand what she meant. The next day I waited at my grandmother's bed, my leg was bouncing anxiously. The woman visiting the other coma patient came in and waved hello as I rushed over, taking her aback. Can you do it? Can you really contact my mother? I'm sure I looked like a crazy person to them. Ah yes hon, we can certainly try. She looked me up down. Is everything okay, sweetie? I didn't know what to say. A knot in my stomach and throat wouldn't let me communicate more. Yes, no, I just really need to find some answers. After a moment in silence she smiled and nodded, gesturing for me to follow her. After driving a short while we arrived at Giselle's house. The Victorian styling somehow went with the medium job. When we entered I expected rugs on the walls and a big crystal ball, but inside looked like any normal house. She gestured me over to a large Baroque dining room table, telling me some story about how it had been in her family for generations. We sat down next to each other with her at the head. The lights were low and she had lit a few candles. Even after requesting this in desperation I felt thoroughly silly. I was hurt and looking for answers anywhere, and I foolishly clung onto this woman. I was about to say I had made a mistake when Giselle took my hand. Her eyes were closed as she gripped my hand. Tell me the name of your mother, child. Catherine Palmer, I uttered bashfully, feeling the situation had gotten out of hand. Breathing in, Giselle called out loudly, Catherine Palmer, we call to ether to summon your presence. Catherine, your daughter is here and needs to speak with you. We sat in silence for a moment too long. It's okay, Giselle, I was just in pain. And then Giselle grabbed my hand with inhuman strength. An invisible force blew the candles out and the light flickered as Giselle's eyes were wide open, staring at me. Run, little angel, run. The eyes are trying to find you and I cannot keep you hidden any longer. Mother? I cried out. Giselle's grip would not let me go despite my straining. As I stared at Giselle, a chill in the air came with my breath becoming visible. Giselle's eyes began to bleed and the crimson tears streaked her face as her mouth became rictus. In horror her mouth made sounds that should not be able to be made by a human. The words, though unknown, are burned into my memory. Et vidi mulierum sedendum super bestium coccinium, plenum nominibus blasphemus, habentum capita septem et cornua decem. Over and over she repeated these lines, which struck abject terror in me. The blood from her eyes now pooled on the table. As I stared at the puddles of blood, more eyes inside the ichor looked back at me. I screamed a scream of primal terror. As I let loose my scream I heard the reverberating second voice, the voice of my mother, telling me to run. As she did, the voice screaming at me in its unknown tones cut out and Giselle snapped backwards, falling over, and the lights returned to normal. My hand freed, I rushed to Giselle. Her eyes were locked open as blood poured from them as they drifted to me. Run, little angel, and her eyes closed. That was 3 days ago. I'm writing this to try to put some semblance of order to this insanity in my life. I stared at myself in the mirror in my grandmother's foyer when I got back from getting Giselle to the hospital. Every day since I've found myself staring at that mirror, at myself. My existence seems to cause other pain. I don't know what my mother did or why. All I do know is out of the corner of my eyes, it's slight, but in that mirror I can see a pair of eyes staring back, watching me.